Yeah. Okay, so I chose to do Dorothea Dix and the introduction of asylums into the United States. So a little bit of background on Dix. She was born in 1802. She had a bit of a difficult childhood. Her mother was chronically ill and her father was an alcoholic. So at the age of 12, she actually moved to live with her wealthy grandmother. And there she was a teacher out of her grandmother's house for young girls. She also suffered from malaise, which today would have been diagnosed as clinical depression. And some people argue that that's the reason why she was such an advocate for the mentally ill. So Dix seeks treatment. Because she came from such a wealthy family, her physician actually encouraged her to travel abroad for treatment. So she goes to England, she overcomes malaise, and she credits all of it to the conditions that she experienced while she was there. And this really sets the scene for how Dix believes the environment should be for the mentally ill. So she comes back to the US when her grandmother dies, and she starts working as a Sunday school teacher for girls out of jail. And there she saw some really horrible conditions. You know, they weren't clothed, there was no heat, they were beating them. And she spends the next 2 years touring jails, poorhouses, almshouses, and records all of the observations. And she finds that most, if not all, of the people in the jails were experiencing some sort of mental illness. So now remember, she believes that by changing the environment, individuals can be cured of mental illness. So she takes all of this observational data she gathered and puts it into manuscripts and then lobbies for federal and state governments to put aside money and places for better conditions of the mentally ill. So in 1843, she submits her big report to the Massachusetts state legislature, and they did set aside money to expand an existing state mental hospital in Worcester. And this is a little quote from her excerpt. So while she's out lobbying for this, there's also a guy named Thomas Story Kirkbride, and he's writing this book on how the setup and the architecture should be for these buildings. So basically he says that they need to be in this V shape, and the people who have the most severe mental illnesses will be on the outside, and the people who are going to be released will be closer to the middle. And basically the V shape will allow for all this fresh air, and you can see there's lots of windows, so natural lighting was really important. And then I have a couple more pictures. So this is obviously after the asylum was abandoned, but you can see these are like 12 to 16 foot windows, and it's really beautiful. He also incorporated like entertainment features. We don't really think of that when we think of asylums, but they had bowling alleys and ballrooms, and people were really proud of the asylums. They put them on postcards and broadcasted it all over, you know. And he and Dix had frequent correspondence throughout her lobbying, and he included pushes for her advocacy in his writings. So a little recap of the timeline. 1843, there's 18 asylums. Shortly after Dix presents her manuscript. 1854, Kirkbride finishes his book, publishes it. It was a huge success. And then 1861, the Civil War comes along. Dix actually drops her advocacy and goes and helps out in the Civil War. She was sent home later because she had some issues with like having to be in charge of people. But 1880, then now we have 180, almost all Kirkbride built asylums. And then in 1887, Dix dies. Obviously that's not what we think of when we think of asylums today. So what went wrong? There's a couple big factors to consider. First one was the Civil War. The Civil War really drew the government's attention away from asylums to bigger problems at the time. And it also increased the need for asylums afterwards. A lot of soldiers were experiencing what we now know as PTSD. So people were really lining up to get put in. And that leads to overcrowding. There's a couple big instances of overcrowding I'll talk about in a second. And then underfunding. Because of the overcrowding, all the rich people were leaving and going to other places, so they didn't have a lot of paying patients. And the government also didn't have as much money for them after the Civil War. And then last, with no supervision, the asylums were kind of on the hill far away. No one's really checking in on them. People would just bring their family members there and then leave them there and never come back and check on them. So this kind of opened the door for psychiatrists at the time to start experimenting, which They talked a lot about how they really thought that this was a good idea and that they were going to be able to cure these people by doing shock therapy and lobotomies, but no one was really watching what they were doing. So, the Buffalo Asylum, Kirkbride said that no asylum should have more than 250 people. How many people do you guys think they put in the Buffalo Asylum? Who wants to guess? How many?
Over 1,000?
So yeah, so he said no more than 250, and the state said, how about 600? And he voted no, told them not to build it, and they said, yes, we're going to do it anyway. And they actually put 3,600 people in it. No change in staff though, same number of staff as it would have been for 250 people. So obviously that creates some problems. And then 1950s, we have 500,000 Americans in asylums. And then the 60s come and they created new laws banning the patients from working, and you're probably like, oh, well, they're not the doctors, so what were they doing? They just had various roles like, you know, laundry and cooking, and they held, a lot of them were very functional, so they held various positions. And when they took that away, that really hurt the infrastructure inside, and it just kind of started to fall apart. And then the 1970s, they defunded and deinstitutionalized pretty much all asylums. A lot of them are still standing today. A lot of them were taken down, and they want to pretend like that didn't happen. So, what is the legacy of Dorothy? She created 32 mental hospitals in her day, and she also demonstrated that women can be successful. That was really important. She overshadowed Kirkbride in a lot of ways, which, you know, he did build, like, I don't know, they used his plan for hundreds of buildings. So it is kind of interesting that his name doesn't always come up with the advocacy of mental asylums, because he held the same viewpoint and pushed her ideals. But and then a lot of her ideas still resonate today. We still, you know, hopefully don't think that people should be treated like that, and have created like rehab places and some nicer facilities. So where are we today? In some ways we've come a long ways. There's less stigma surrounding mental health treatment, and there are really cool places and people have great experiences going to seek treatment. But in other ways, we still have 43% of state prisoners with a diagnosed mental illness, and those are just the diagnosed ones. A lot of them have never been treated or, you know if they have any diagnosed. So we might be right back to where Dorothea started. You know, do we need to push asylums or push prisons to be better funded, better managed? So the debate continues. Have any questions? Just wait for the clue.
Yep, very late. Okay, so I'm going to bite. You said she had issues during the Civil War in terms of being in charge of people. Okay, I'm going to bite. What are those issues?
Yeah, so basically everyone hated her. She was like in charge of just teaching nurses how to run things, because they're like, oh, you're so good at being an advocate. And everyone hated her so much that she got sent home after 2 years and basically was fired. So it doesn't say exactly why they didn't like her, but it just says there was lots of issues. So it's interesting.
Yes. So you were talking about how like the asylums were shut down, and then you did the stats on the prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
Is it like just did you just focus on prisons, how they replaced asylums, or did you like focus on hospitals as well?
I didn't specifically look at where all those people went. Most of them just kind of went back into the community and later ended up in jail. Some of them did go to other hospitals at the time, but there also just wasn't a lot of beds for them, so they just kind of but that would definitely be something to look into, where exactly all those people went. Yes?
I guess, what do you think is like the next step to take towards getting those prisoners who are undiagnosed? Like what do you think needs to be incorporated now to get that kind of back on track?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a lot of, and in some places there is, but they need to really do thorough mental health assessments when they come in, so they understand what they're dealing with, because a lot of the issues they come in with are then exacerbated in prison. So it just gets worse and worse and worse, to the point where, you know, those people now have severe mental illnesses that's a lot of money and resources, and I think it would be better addressed at the beginning, and we can take steps from there. So
That's all the time we have for.
Sweet.